On the morning of November 22, 1963, Rose Kennedy was on a golf course in Hyannisport, playing a round with her neighbor, the former baseball player Jimmy Pearsall, while her son sat in a motorcade in Dallas. If you're into this kind of close, sourced history, go ahead and subscribe now, because there's a lot more ground to cover. That single detail, an 83-year-old mother out on the links on the day her son was assassinated, has been read two very different ways over the decades. To some biographers, it's nothing at all. An ordinary Friday morning before news anyone could have predicted. To others, including some who spent years studying this family up close, it's one small data point in a much longer, genuinely documented pattern, a relationship between Rose Kennedy and her second son that historians at the University of Virginia's Miller Center have flatly called the most fraught of any she had with her four boys. Whether that adds up to hatred is a different question, and it's worth being honest about the answer before we even start, but the coldness underneath it is real, well documented by people who watched it happen up close, and considerably stranger than the rosary-clutching matriarch most people picture when they hear her name. Rose ran her household like a research project. She kept a literal box of index cards recording each child's illnesses, weights, dental visits, and religious milestones, a system she called scientific mothering, borrowed loosely from parenting theories fashionable among educated women of her generation who wanted their households to look as rigorously managed as any business. She tracked the amount of physical affection she gave each child with the same clinical precision she applied to their vaccination schedules, and at swimming lessons she famously assigned each child a different colored cap, not out of whimsy, but so she could identify and count them at a glance from a distance without needing to actually be in the water with them. Staff and family friends who observed the system up close later described it as impressive and, in the same breath, cold, an approach to raising 9 children that prized order and measurable outcomes over anything resembling spontaneous warmth. It's the first clue that whatever Rose Kennedy's relationship with her children actually was, affection wasn't the organizing principle. Jack, as the family called him, was not a healthy child, and his illnesses started early, at the worst possible moment for his mother to notice. In February 1920, at not yet 3 years old, he contracted scarlet fever, a disease genuinely capable of killing a small child in that era. On the very same day, Rose was in labor giving birth to his younger sister, Kathleen. The family rushed him to Boston City Hospital, while his mother was occupied elsewhere with a delivery of her own, and his father was reportedly terrified he would lose him. Jack recovered, but the recovery was the beginning of a pattern rather than the end of one. Whooping cough, measles, chickenpox, diphtheria, appendicitis, jaundice, asthma, and severe digestive problems followed him through childhood, adolescence, and into his years at Harvard, where a friend later joked that reviewing his own medical chart felt like watching doctors mentally measure him for a coffin. Illness, in other words, wasn't a phase of Jack's childhood. It was the weather he lived in. That weather never really let up, and by the time Jack reached the presidency, a Catholic priest had been called to his bedside to deliver last rites on 5 separate occasions across his life, a fact that stayed almost entirely out of public view during his political career. The first came with that same childhood scarlet fever. The second followed a diagnosis of Addison's disease in a London hospital in 1947, when he was so ill on the transatlantic crossing home that his family feared he wouldn't survive the trip. The third and most dramatic came in 1951, on a trip across Asia with his brother Robert, when a recurrence of the same disease sent his fever past 106 degrees in Tokyo and left him first delirious, then comatose. Doctors doubted he would live, and it was Robert, not Rose, who never left his bedside and personally arranged the medical evacuation that got him to an American military hospital and, ultimately, saved his life. The fourth and fifth both followed a catastrophic 1954 spinal fusion surgery undertaken against his doctor's explicit advice, complications so severe that even Vice President Richard Nixon, hearing updates from the hospital, reportedly wept and said the poor boy was going to die. Rose's own account of that surgery, recorded later in her memoir, describes her son's determination secondhand rather than her own presence at his side, writing simply that Jack was determined to have the operation and had told his father he'd rather be dead than live the rest of his life on crutches. Across every one of these 5 brushes with death, the person consistently shown at the bedside in the historical record is Robert. Rose's own contribution by her own writing arrives afterward, as narration. That weather collided directly with the household Joe Kennedy Sr. and Rose had built, one that ran on ruthless competition rather than accommodation. Touch football at Hyannisport functioned less like a family game and more like an actual tryout. Dinner table conversation was expected to center on current events and debate rather than small talk, with each child required to have read that day's New York Times and be ready to defend an opinion on it, and children were routinely asked to report and defend their day's accomplishments in front of the whole family. Joe Sr.'s patience with his sickly second son was, by multiple accounts, thin. He once greeted a young woman Jack brought home as a date with the blunt question, "Why don't you get a live one?" Rose, according to people who later studied her own private notes, had been the primary hand behind the children's early medical care, but as the boys moved into their teenage years and Jack's illnesses became a chronic, ongoing management problem rather than a childhood phase, she noticeably pulled back, and Joe increasingly took over that part of the household. It was, by more than one historian's reading, a quiet handoff that left an already unwell teenager with even less of his mother's direct attention than before. Rose's own marriage gave her a working model for exactly the kind of emotional management she'd later apply to her children. Joe Sr.'s infidelities were neither subtle nor occasional. The actress Gloria Swanson spent extended stretches as a housiguest at the family's own homes while she and Joe were involved, and Rose, by every surviving account, received her cordially and said essentially nothing about it in public. She did leave once, packing up and returning briefly to her own father's house around 1920 after the arrangement became too much to bear quietly, only to be sent directly back by her father, who told her plainly that she'd made a commitment and needed to honor it. She went back and stayed for the rest of Joe's life. Whatever Rose actually felt about any of it stayed almost entirely private, filed away, much like her children's illnesses, as something to be managed rather than discussed. What survives from people who actually watched this relationship up close is strikingly consistent. Kennedy told one of his own White House aides, as an adult, that he could not remember his mother ever once saying the words "I love you" to him. A family friend, trying to explain the president's own visible discomfort with physical affection, said it had to trace back to his mother, calling her so cold, so distant from the whole thing, that he doubted she'd ever so much as rumpled the boy's hair in his entire childhood. Another friend recalled watching the children at Hyannisport essentially rout around her entirely, saying plainly that Daddy was it, that Rose played golf alone, prayed alone, and moved through the household largely as a separate, self-contained figure rather than its emotional center. It's worth being fair to her here too. The same distant mother spent real, deliberate effort retelling her children's stories from American history, Bunker Hill, Concord, Plymouth Rock, and took them on outings to the actual sites, a habit historians have directly credited with feeding the young Jack's own lifelong fascination with history, one that eventually produced his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Profiles in Courage. Rose's affection, in other words, wasn't absent so much as redirected, expressed through curated educational experiences rather than through anything resembling physical warmth. Jack himself, even as a boy, noticed and said so out loud. Rose traveled frequently, for both social and personal reasons, crossing the Atlantic for extended stretches even while her younger children were still small, and on at least one occasion a young Jack confronted her about it directly, telling her, with the kind of blunt honesty children specialize in, "Gee, you're a great mother to go away and leave your children alone." Rose herself, decades later, insisted she never experienced these absences as abandonment, and her own letters home from these trips are warm and attentive on the page. Her children, for their part, wrote back constantly, small handwritten notes asking when she was coming home and describing school plays she'd missed, a correspondence that reads, in hindsight, like two generations narrating a relationship past each other rather than through each other. Historians who've studied the family's internal dynamics point to Jack's blunt childhood remarks specifically as an early sign of exactly the friction that would define this particular mother-son relationship for decades afterward, distinct from her relationships with her other three sons in both intensity and duration. If you're hooked already, the subscribe button is right there, and it genuinely helps get the next one made. Complicating things further, Jack was never his mother's obvious priority to begin with. That role belonged, from early childhood onward, to his older brother, Joseph Jr., groomed openly by both parents as the family's future political star, the one Joe Sr. expected to become the first Catholic president of the United States, a plan the family discussed openly enough that even outsiders knew about it. The competition between the two boys wasn't gentle. One particularly brutal childhood bicycle collision, provoked by an actual race between the brothers down a hill, left Jack with 28 stitches, a fairly literal scar from growing up in his older brother's shadow. Within the wider household of 9 children, Joe Jr., Jack, and their sister Kathleen, known as Kick, formed what family friends described as a kind of inner circle. 3 personality kids whose charisma and constant activity set the tone for the household, while the younger 6 children, including Jack's future running mates Robert and Ted, grew up further from the center of attention still. Rose's own attention, by most accounts of the era, followed the family's larger investment strategy, tracking closely with whichever son currently carried the political inheritance rather than distributing itself evenly. Jack absorbed the family's constant emphasis on winning, without ever quite being cast as the one who was supposed to. That arrangement ended on August 12, 1944, when Joe Jr.'s Navy plane exploded on a secret bombing mission over the English Channel, killing him instantly, on a mission he had reportedly volunteered for at least partly out of a need to outdo his younger brother's own recent wartime heroics in the Pacific. The political ambition Joe Sr. and, by extension, Rose had invested in their eldest son transferred almost immediately onto Jack, not because he'd shown any burning desire for the job himself, but because the family, as one later documentary put it, simply needed a new vessel for the same plan. Rose herself later wrote that she never fully recovered from Joe Jr.'s death, and some biographers have suggested that Jack, stepping into a role built for a brother their mother had openly preferred, spent much of his own political career operating in the emotional shadow of a comparison he could never actually win. Jack became a congressman 2 years later, a senator 6 years after that, and president 16 years after his brother's death, carrying a political inheritance that had never actually been designed with him in mind, running on the momentum of a dead brother's unfinished ambition rather than his mother's belief in him specifically. Rose's capacity for emotional distance showed itself in an even starker way with her eldest daughter. In 1941, Rosemary, who had intellectual disabilities from birth, underwent a lobotomy arranged primarily by Joe Sr., while Rose was reportedly not even informed until after the procedure had already taken place, a procedure that left her permanently and severely disabled, unable to walk or speak coherently for the rest of her life. By most credible accounts, Rose wasn't meaningfully consulted beforehand, and she didn't see her own daughter again for roughly 20 years afterward, choosing not to visit the institution where Rosemary lived even as she continued raising the rest of the family and building an increasingly public profile of her own. That gap, biographers have connected less to any specific cruelty and more to the same instinct that shaped so much of Rose's parenting: manage the difficult thing quietly, keep the family's public image intact, and let painful realities exist somewhere just outside her own direct attention. It's the same instinct, other biographers have argued, that shows up in her relationship with Jack, just expressed less dramatically, a pattern of handling pain by simply not looking directly at it. Rose's own priorities, by her own actions if not always her own words, leaned heavily towards status and image. During Joe Sr.'s years as ambassador to Britain in the late 1930s, she threw herself into the social requirements of the role with real enthusiasm, curating the family's wardrobe, appearances, and public presentation with the same meticulous attention she'd once given her children's index cards, and biographers have generally agreed she found genuine satisfaction in the prestige of the position itself, presented at the court of St. James's and photographed constantly as one of the most fashionable political wives in the world. Jacqueline Kennedy, who watched Rose operate at close range for more than a decade as her daughter-in-law, later gave a notably unflattering private assessment, describing her as an image-driven woman more invested in the social benefits of the Kennedy name than in what Jackie called the warmer sides of mothering, a judgment that lines up closely with the accounts left by Jack's own aides and friends. It's a specific, pointed criticism coming from a daughter-in-law who'd spent years being mailed unsolicited corrections about her own public appearance from the same woman. Rose's instinct to manage rather than embrace extended directly to the young woman Jack married. When Jack wed Jacqueline Bouvier at St. Mary's Church in Newport in September 1953, the wedding itself functioned largely as a production organized around Joe Sr.'s wishes, with every significant detail requiring his personal approval, while Rose settled almost immediately into the same corrective role she'd played with her own children for decades, mailing her new daughter-in-law clippings of her public appearances with fashion errors circled in ink. Barbara Perry, a historian who spent years working directly through Rose's own donated papers at the Kennedy Library, described the early correspondence between the two women as consistently cool and chilly, preserved in Rose's own handwriting inside an archive Rose herself chose to make public. Jackie, for her part, gave her mother-in-law the polite, distancing nickname Belle-Mère, French for mother-in-law, a title that kept exactly the kind of formal space between them Rose seemed to prefer with nearly everyone in her own family. None of this meant Rose was absent from Jack's political rise. Quite the opposite, she became one of his most tireless campaign assets, delivering speeches in a soft, practiced voice that reporters found genuinely effective, hosting the famous Kennedy Tea Parties that helped win over Massachusetts voters one living room at a time, and lending the family's respectability to a candidate still facing real anti-Catholic suspicion in parts of the country during the 1960 race. By some estimates, she personally attended hundreds of these campaign events across the country, well into her 70s, treating the effort with the same disciplined thoroughness she'd once applied to a box of medical index cards. It's a genuinely strange combination when you look at it directly. A mother who worked as hard as almost anyone in the family machine to get her son elected president, while apparently never managing, in his own recollection, to tell him she loved him along the way. Devotion to the Kennedy Project and warmth toward the individual son turned out to be two entirely separate things Rose was capable of at once. Less than a year into Jack's presidency, in December 1961, Joe Sr. suffered a massive stroke that left him partially paralyzed and largely unable to speak for the rest of his life. Rose, now in her 70s herself, became his primary caretaker, a role reversal from 4 decades of a marriage in which she'd been the one absorbing hardship silently while he moved through the world largely unaccountable to her. Visitors to the family compound in these years described a specific, quiet ritual. Jack, whenever he visited Hyannisport, made a point of sitting with his now silent father, and in October 1963, in what turned out to be their final conversation, he reportedly told a friend afterward, gesturing toward the man who'd shaped so much of the family's ambition, that his father was the one who'd made all of this possible, and look at him now. Rose managed her husband's care for years afterward with the same disciplined, unsentimental competence she'd once applied to her children's medical index cards, tending to a man whose own infidelities she'd absorbed in silence decades earlier. Rose managed her own inner life largely apart from the rest of the family, retreating to a separate cottage at Hyannisport specifically to pray alone, an intensely devout Roman Catholic who found in religious contemplation the kind of steady structure she never quite offered her children directly, attending Mass daily for most of her adult life regardless of what else was happening in the household. Some who watched her over the years suspected she found a certain quiet pride in enduring hardship, including her husband's well-documented infidelities, with visible stoicism rather than complaint, treating suffering silently as its own kind of achievement, almost a private form of martyrdom she never asked anyone to acknowledge. That same instinct, developed over 4 decades of marriage, would define the single most quoted moment of her entire public life. She was still on that golf course in Hyannisport when the news reached the family compound on November 22, 1963. President and Lady Bird Johnson called Rose directly from Air Force One roughly 30 minutes after leaving Dallas, becoming among the first to offer her their condolences before most of the country even understood what had happened. By her own family's later account, Rose nearly broke down in the hours after learning her son was dead. She caught herself, regained her composure, and delivered a line that would follow her for the rest of her life. "No one," she said, "will ever feel sorry for me." At the funeral days later, standing beside Ethiopia's Emperor Haile Selassie, she offered a second line that's been quoted almost as often since. "It's wrong for parents to bury their children," she said. It should be the other way around. Both moments capture the same woman perfectly, genuine grief, immediately folded into discipline and composure, private devastation converted, almost on instinct, into a public performance of endurance rather than open emotion. She would need that same discipline again less than 5 years later, when her third son, Robert, was assassinated in Los Angeles in June 1968, and reporters at the time noted she handled the second loss with the identical, practiced stoicism she'd shown after the first. In 1974, at 83 years old, Rose published her own memoir, Times to Remember, her direct opportunity to answer decades of exactly the kind of coldness her own children's friends had been describing to reporters for years. The book is, by design, warm and controlled, full of the same historical anecdotes and family pride she'd always projected publicly, and largely silent on the specific grievances Jack himself had voiced to his aides. She wrote about Jack's illnesses with real detail and evident concern, describing him as a very, very sick little boy and recording his frailty in exactly the careful, factual tone of the index cards she'd once kept. But the book consistently narrates from a position of oversight and management rather than physical presence. Reviewers at the time and biographers since have noted the same pattern running through nearly 500 pages, a woman capable of extraordinary detail about her children's lives and remarkably reluctant, even in her own account of it, to describe simply holding them. Grief, for Rose, consistently turned into institutions rather than into visible mourning. Following Joe Jr.'s death in the war, she and Joe Sr. established the Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. Foundation in 1946, directing its funds toward research and care for people with intellectual disabilities, a cause tied directly to Rosemary's own life and one Rose stayed personally involved with for the rest of her days, eventually helping push her daughter Eunice toward founding what became the Special Olympics, an event Rose herself led the grandparents' parade at when she was 90 years old. After Jack's death, she spent years working to secure and restore his Brookline birthplace as a National Historic Site, personally recording an audio tour of the house that still plays for visitors today, walking room by room through a version of Jack's earliest childhood narrated entirely in her own voice. It's a strange kind of memorial, coming from the same woman who couldn't be recalled ever telling that child she loved him, devotion expressed decades later, at full volume, in exactly the institutional, effortful register she'd always been most comfortable working in. Rose outlived 4 of her 9 children, a fact she once summarized, without much embellishment, as a life made up of agonies and ecstasies in roughly equal measure. She kept a genuinely active public schedule well into her 90s, but in April 1984, at 93, she suffered a stroke that left her confined to a wheelchair for the remaining 11 years of her life, spent almost entirely at the family compound in Hyannisport under the care of private nurses. She turned 100 in July 1990 and died of complications from pneumonia on January 22, 1995, at 104 years old, making her, at the time, the longest-lived relative of any American president in the country's history. Her youngest son, Ted, the last of her children still living by then, was at her bedside when she died, and in his eulogy he offered a description that, more than any single anecdote about coldness or distance, seems to have genuinely captured how her own surviving children understood her. She sustained them, he said, through their saddest times, by her faith in God and by a character that combined the sweetest gentleness with the most tempered steel. Call it whatever fits the thumbnail, but hatred is almost certainly the wrong word for what actually sat between Rose Kennedy and her second son. What the record actually supports, from his own aides, his own friends, the historians who've spent careers studying this specific relationship, and Rose's own writing, is something closer to a permanent, low-grade distance. A mother who managed her children's illnesses on index cards instead of at bedsides, who was in labor with another child the day Jack first nearly died, who couldn't be recalled ever saying the words her son needed to hear, who handed off his sickest years to a father famous for asking why he couldn't bring home someone healthier, who narrated his 5 brushes with death from a slight remove rather than from his actual bedside, and who nonetheless worked as hard as anyone alive to put that same son in the White House. She spent the decades after his death funding disability research in his dead brother's name, restoring his own childhood home down to the smallest detail, and narrating its audio tour in her own voice. Devotion expressed, as always, through institutions and effort, rather than through anything resembling the words, "Gee, you're a great mother," once accused her of withholding. That's not hatred. It's something more familiar and, in its own way, considerably sadder. A woman who built an entire life around loving her children through management rather than through presence, and a son who noticed the difference for the rest of his own life, right up until the morning his mother was on a golf course and he wasn't anywhere his family could reach him at all.